The question is, your video on the nonsense of non-self helped me clarify my thinking. And I wonder if you have anything else to say about the concept that there is no one here, or the concept of no self, no problem, even the Buddhist idea of emptiness. Okay, so yeah, I think a lot of the things that I've said about non-self kind of applies to this, but certainly there's more to say about it. There are those teachers out there, and I watch some of these videos where they sit there and say, there's no one here. And my mind has always worked a certain way, that I always try to step outside of any viewpoint and look at it from a different perspective. So when I hear someone say, there's no one here, my mind immediately says, then who's talking? If there's no one there saying what you're saying, who's saying it? And the next question is, who are you talking to? If there's nobody there listening, who are you talking to? And then the third question is, why are you talking? Why are you saying what you're saying? I mean, if you really fully believe that you don't exist, right? Why would you talk to other people? Because if you don't exist, why does it matter to you whether other people accept that they don't exist or are suffering from the illusion that they do exist? Why would that matter to you if you have realized that you don't exist? So what I'm basically saying here is that, to me, this is just an example of how the mind can create this closed system where people are absolutely convinced that it's real what they believe, but it's nonsensical, it's an illusion, it's illogical, it's self-contradictory. You know, I have one of my How the World Works videos where I talk about this, how the mind can deceive itself. And to me, this is an example of this. You have convinced yourself that you don't exist. But who is the one that says there is no one here? There has got to be a self. There will always be a self that experiences, or you wouldn't be here to say it. If you didn't exist, you wouldn't be here to say you don't exist. So if you want to be really philosophical about this, you can say that, to me, spiritual growth, spiritual teachings, understanding spiritual teachings, it has two aspects. There's two legs of spiritual progress. One is understanding with the mind, but the other is direct experience. Intuitive experience, mystical experience, non-dual experience. And there are a lot of people out there who either they haven't had an intuitive experience, so it's all in the mind, or they have had some intuitive experiences, but they are still interpreting them with the mind. They are not using the intuitive experiences to overcome the mind and its interpretation, to expand their understanding, to transcend their present way of looking at life. And that's, to me, that's the purpose of an intuitive experience, because I have realized for a long time that the mind has limitations. The rational, linear, analytical mind, it has limitations. There's a limitation to what we can understand. And one of the limitations has a bearing on this. So to me, what has happened here is that there are some people who have started to realize that the problems we are having, the suffering we are having, is caused by our own minds. And this is part of awakening. This is part of the process of spiritual growth, is that we realize that our suffering is not caused by external conditions. It's caused by internal conditions in our own psychology. So these people then come to realize that there is something in our minds that's causing the suffering, And many people out there who write about self-help, they talk about an ego, which is an alien thing in our psychology that causes our suffering. But there are also some people that have that talk about a self. So they are saying, they are starting to identify, which I think is valid, that the self, there's a self that causes the suffering. But now they're using the mind, and the linear analytical mind works this way, that it always looks for differentiations, opposites. It's not necessarily dualistic in the terms that I have defined duality in my non-duality videos, where there's a value judgment. But the mind is always looking for contrast. So in other words, the mind says, I see that suffering is caused by internal conditions, and the internal condition is that we have a self. So therefore, it reasons that the way to overcome suffering is to have no self. Is to go from a state of being identified with the self to not being identified as a self. In other words, there's no one here. You realize that you're suffering because you think you are a particular person, a particular somebody. So you can overcome suffering by stopping to think that, and therefore accepting that you don't exist, there's nobody here. And then they think this will remove your suffering. And to me, it's it's a flawed reasoning. It's just this, what the mind does. And they don't realize that this is what the mind does. So they think this is some ultimate wisdom they discovered, that there's no one here. But it's also impossible, because as I said, you can never come to a point where there's no one here. Because you can't experience that there's nobody here. Okay? So what did I say when I said if we want to be philosophical about it? Okay. If there is no one here, there can't be any experience. Right? So I said, there's two legs of spiritual progress. We understand with the mind, and we have a direct experience of a reality that's outside the mind, that's beyond the understanding of the mind. So if you think about this, how would you experience that there's no one here? You can't. Because only if there's a you can there be an experience. So this means what? It means that to me, I have benefited from expanding my understanding of spiritual concepts, but what has driven my spiritual path has always been these experiences, direct experience, direct mystical experience, and in a direct mystical experience, you step outside the mind. You're not reasoning. The experience is an experience, it's not a reasoning, because reasoning is always from a distance. Experience is you are experiencing it, you are there. So there's value in understanding, but the real value in spiritual growth, what really drives your spiritual growth, is direct experience. So experience is always more important than understanding. So what I'm saying is, you cannot experience nothing. You cannot experience no self. You cannot experience that there's no one here. But the mind can theorize about it. The mind can project the mental image that because it's the self that causes suffering, if you have no self, you're not suffering. But you can't experience it. And therefore, to me, it's just mind games. It's just a mind game. Okay? It's created in the mind, and these people are just using the mind to endlessly build onto it by this subtle reasoning. Okay, so now, take it a step further. What I've said in many of my videos is that we have created all of these selves in the subconscious mind. And it is these selves that cause us to suffer. I agree with that. But it's not the self that causes us to suffer. It's the separate selves that cause us to suffer. And there's a multiplicity of these separate selves. But what is the self then? What is the self that gives us the sense that I exist, that I am? Well, that's what I have called the conscious you. And the importance of that concept is that the conscious you is neutral. I've also used the word that it's pure awareness. And what I mean with that is not that it's undifferentiated awareness, but that the conscious you is not, it's not your outer personality. In other words, we can say all of these separate selves we have created in the subconscious mind, they form the outer personality. How we see ourselves in relation to the world, how we react to the world. And this is where suffering is experienced. When the conscious you goes into one of these separate selves and its vision of the world is colored by the separate self, by the perception filter of that self. It's like putting colored glasses in front of your eyes. So it is these separate selves that give us the experience of suffering. In other words, suffering is not real. It's not. There is no actual suffering that takes place. Suffering is an experience. If I put yellow glasses in front of my eyes, the sky appears green, but the sky hasn't changed color. It's my experience of the sky that has changed. So the conscious you is not suffering because the conscious you is neutral. What causes suffering is what I've talked about with the duality consciousness. The duality consciousness always puts up two polarities and it imposes a value judgment. So in other words, there's a separate self that looks at the world and it says, this should be happening, this is good, this should not be happening because this is bad. For example, people should be nice to me, they shouldn't be rude to me. So this conscious self or this subconscious self is now constantly evaluating every situation you encounter based on this. Are people nice to me? Or are they rude to me? This means that the self is constantly suffering. Because it's always looking for when are people going to be nice to me? Or they shouldn't have been rude to me. Why did they do this? Why did they say this? So it's constantly in this push and pull. It's not in the now, as some spiritual teachers say. It's always either in the future or in the past. So this is what causes suffering. But the conscious you is still not suffering. It's experiencing the suffering of that separate self, just like I'm experiencing the sky being green when I put yellow glasses on. It's just an experience. And the magic of this teaching is that if the conscious you can become aware that it is not suffering, that it's just an experience that comes through a separate self. Conscious you can become aware, oh, I have yellow glasses on, let me take them off, then I can see the sky is blue. So the conscious you is neutral about whatever happens on earth. It's just an experience, but it's neither good nor bad. It doesn't have the value judgment. So it is these separate selves that have the two polarities, should happen, shouldn't happen, and the value judgment. That's what causes suffering. So it's not a matter of getting rid of the sense of self. It's a matter of getting rid of these specific subconscious separate selves based on the illusion of separation and the consciousness of duality. That's why I've said over and over again, you cannot grasp non-duality if you don't understand the duality consciousness. And basically, to put it directly, I would say, any teacher who claims to be teaching non-duality, but isn't talking about the duality consciousness, he's basically giving people an impossible goal. It's like you are saying, and it may be valid what he's saying about non-duality and attaining non-duality and overcoming this duality. But if he's not talking about the duality consciousness that pulls you in to duality, pulls you away from non-duality, how are people going to achieve it? It's like you have a person who is standing up there on a mountain and he is saying, oh yeah, just come up here to me. The view is great from up here. But he is denying that there's a staircase that leads up there. So you're supposed to just what? Levitate up there? And what I'm saying is that if you really want to help people, you give them a goal, yes, but you also point out there's a staircase that leads you step by step by step to the goal, and if you keep taking one step at a time, you will reach the goal. And that's what is the case with the teachings about the subconscious selves. You keep dissolving one self at a time, you will overcome suffering and attain peace of mind. So to me, it's part of the cruelty of non-duality to come to people and say, you're suffering because you have a self, and you just need to overcome the self and have no self and realize that you don't exist. Yeah, I mean, it's nonsensical, right? But there's more than that, because now that you got me started, what's the problem on earth? If you want to say it that way, But let's just go with this. Let's say, what is the problem on earth? Well, the problem is that, as I have explained it, people have gone into this state of separation and duality. And as a result of this, people are denying who they are. We are in reality spiritual beings. We are out of the one mind, because there is only one mind. But we are extensions of the one mind. So basically we can say that when we go into duality, we go into a state of self-denial. We are denying who we really are, so that we can create the illusion that we are a separate self, and we can act as a separate self instead of acting as a connected being. Because when you're a connected being, you will follow the golden rule that every religion teaches. You will do unto others what you want them to do unto you if you realize you're connected, because you realize, if I harm you, I'm harming myself. When you go into the illusion of separation, you think you can do something to others, it's not going to harm yourself. You think you can get an advantage out of doing to other people what you wouldn't want them to do to you. And you think you can do to other people without having them do to you or having the universe do to you. So in other words, the problem on earth, if you want to look at it that way, is self-denial. You are denying that you are a connected self, and you're seeing yourself as a separate self. Now, as I've explained, once you go into this being a separate self can only suffer. So it's correct. The separate self is the cause of suffering. And if you can get rid of the separate self, yes, your suffering will be over. But getting rid of the separate self doesn't mean you get rid of any self or any sense of self. It means that you stop denying that you are a real self, that you are a connected self, that you are out of the one mind. Because, as I explained in my How the World Was Created video, we are created to be co-creators and gradually transcend our sense of self until we reach the same sense of self as the Creator who created us. And so saying that the goal of existence is to achieve a state of non-existence, it's a denial of who we are. It's self-denial. And that's why, to me, the teachings, many of the teachings on non-self, and this idea that there's no one here, it's just a more subtle form of self-denial. You're denying who you are. You're denying your potential to expand your sense of self, to transcend your sense of self. And it's correct, we're not the separate self. The separate self or the separate selves are not ultimately real. Yes, but there is a self that is ultimately real, and that's your higher self, your I Am Presence. It is an extension of the Creator's being, and it's an extension of the one mind. We don't return to the one mind by ceasing to exist, but by transcending our sense of self until we reach the same level of self as the Creator who created us. That is the process of life. That is why there is a world. That is why the world was created as an environment in which we can expand our sense of self by interacting with that environment. That's the purpose. And if you are just saying that the purpose of existence is to attain non-existence, you are denying that. And that is self-denial. And how is that spiritual? Now, concept of emptiness. I'm not a Buddhist scholar, but as I understand the concept of emptiness, it's again this, there's an Eastern mindset, and then there's the Western mindset, which is much more linear. So, as I understand this, and maybe I'm not entirely correct, but on the other hand, who is correct? Because you look at these Buddhist explanations out there, and even the Buddhist scholars don't agree on how to interpret this. So the way I would interpret the concept of emptiness is, as I just said, we have these separate selves that are based on this dualistic polarities, what the Buddha called the pairs, and a value judgment, right and wrong, good and bad. This should happen, this shouldn't happen. And this means that when you go into these separate selves, you are looking at the world, and you are interpreting everything in the world based on the separate self, the basic view of the separate self, and this value judgment. This is right, this is wrong, this should happen, this shouldn't happen. You're also completely identifying yourself with outer circumstances, such as, I'm a man, I'm white, I have blue eyes, I have blonde hair, I'm a Christian, I'm a Muslim, I'm this, I'm that. All of these outer characteristics, we identify ourselves based on that. And to me, the Buddhic concept of emptiness is that we come to realize that we are not all of these outer things. And it's in the vocabulary I'm using here, there are other ways to explain it, of course, but the vocabulary I'm using here, it is that the conscious you stops identifying itself with all the outer things, all the outer characteristics and all the subconscious selves. And the conscious you realizes it's pure awareness. And that is, in a sense, the way I understand what the Buddha meant when he said emptiness. And it's also what you could say is a state of no self, because it's not these specific outer selves. I would, instead of emptiness, I would use the word neutrality, because to me that makes more sense. But that could just be a personal preference. But to me, neutrality means that the conscious you realizes, I am not this particular self that has this value judgment. I am not a white male. I am not Danish. I am not a Christian. I'm not a spiritual believer. I'm not this or that. It just goes into a state of neutrality and realizes I'm beyond all of this. You can still express yourself through the outer personality that you have, but you're not identified with it. You're not attached to it. So what you are really saying is that the separate selves, they are applying some kind of meaning to everything that happens in life. Everything that happens has a meaning according to the worldview of the separate self. It shouldn't have happened, it should have happened, it's bad, it's good, it's this, it's that. But what the Buddha said was that once we, as I would say, the conscious you steps outside of identifying itself with all these outer selves, you see that all of these meanings that the outer selves apply, they're empty. There's emptiness of meaning. It's also the concept you find in some Buddhist teachings that nothing is happening. In other words, the separate selves have a specific view that something here is happening that shouldn't have happened or that should have happened. It's either good or bad. But when you step outside of these, you realize nothing is happening according to this value judgment. It doesn't mean that there's nothing taking place. It doesn't mean there's no world. Right? It's not that we go into this, only Brahman is real, the world is an illusion, and we think everything in the world is an illusion. We are realizing, accepting, well, yeah, whether this is a reality or simulator or not, there is an environment I'm in. There is a planet, there are other people here, they do certain things. But it's just that nothing is happening based on this dualistic value judgment. You're just observing, oh yeah, so this person did that. Does that mean I need to react to it at all? Maybe I just don't react to this. Maybe I'm just non-attached. You have, for me, the most inspiring image is the Buddha. He's on the brink of going into nirvana. He's sitting under the bo tree in meditation, and the demons of Mara start parading in front of him. And all they're trying to do is to pull him into reacting to something. They're trying to throw everything at him in the world to get him to react to something. And the way to ultimately reach Buddhahood and go into nirvana is you have no reaction to anything on earth because you're neutral. You don't see anything happening. And it's like Jesus said, the prince of this world cometh and has nothing in me, whereby he can pull me into reacting. So, though this is, to me, the state to achieve, but it's not a state of no self, that there's nobody here. There is somebody here. I am observing the world, and I am choosing not to react. And by coming to the ultimate state where I have no reaction to anything in the world, I can then graduate from schoolroom earth, graduate from this reality simulator, and ascend to a higher level where I can continue to expand my sense of self. But it's at a level where there's no duality. It's not like it is on earth. In the spiritual realm, nobody's in duality. So you have transcended that level. So that's what it means to me. I hope that's useful to somebody.